And we're back with your regularly scheduled Mythic Plus programming. With Season 4 on the horizon, I decided that it was going to be a good time to kind of take all the dungeons that we're going to be seeing in Season 4 and talking about kind of what to expect with them. As it is all 8 of the Dragonflight dungeons, and if you've played the entire expansion, you've kind of seen these dungeons before, it should be a little bit easier to get into, so maybe I'm going to make this a little bit less in-depth than I have in the past. But I do still want to kind of talk about some of the things that you should be looking to expect with the dungeons themselves. And first and foremost, there has been some mechanical and dungeon changes that maybe we should cover. A lot of them aren't like super impactful. I would say some of the bigger ones is Halls of Infusion now has an additional checkpoint. The containment apparatus mobs in Halls of Infusion now do a little bit less damage than they were before. The Crashing Tsunami Gauntlet final boss mechanic gauntlet is now been normalized to percentage HP as opposed to being time-based. It now casts away occurs at 50% health, was previously 100 energy, so that's a pretty huge change. Azure Vault has some stuff on Umbral Skull, where now the oppressive miasma slow mechanic is completely removed, and now instead the hardened crystal, whenever it has the shield on it, it now pulses arcane damage while the crystal is shielded, and it's a lot of damage, as you'll see in some of the b-roll footage that we're going to be showing here in a little bit. For Brackenhide Hollow, not a ton has changed. I think the biggest thing was like the debuff change. Basically, first off, Blizzard's made Stink Breath and some of the other mobs a little bit easier, but on top of that, they made the Rot Hexers at the end of the dungeon. They changed how that disease debuff actually works, and now that's a lot more dangerous, just as a general result. For Neltharus, they changed the chains, how the chains work. Now Burning Chains can only be used once, and Burning Chains now will stun all enemies hit and increase their damage taken by 50% for 5 seconds. So this is probably ideal for your tank or your healer to be doing this. That way your DPS can actually kind of focus on, optimizing the 50% damage taken. But now this is going to change structurally what Neltharus looks like. It also, they changed how the curse works in this dungeon. So it's going to be a bit easier to not have a decurse in this place. Also, they removed the hunt style ability. Beyond that, there was some change to the birds that wasn't noted here, but we'll talk about those in a little bit, as well as we get into just Nokhud Offensive. Beyond that, there's not really too much else. Lost Door's fiery surge damage has also been reduced by 50%, but this was something that wasn't previously working, and again, we'll kind of talk about that. There's also been some undocumented changes. Umbral Skull's Crystal spawned closer to the boss. For Algethar Academy, the Spell Scepter's Mystic Blast is now unkickable, but can be CC'd, so you need to make sure that you're using CCs on that now. Croth Tornadoes have a better graphic. Brackenhide Hollow, Withering Dot damage triple now scales with key level, which is from the Rotsinger's. And now Withering Dot damage sourced from a Rotsinger's Totem now double dips from key level and fortified modifiers. I think that this is likely to get fixed, or maybe it's already been fixed at the time of recording this. The Necrotic Breath is no longer kickable, but it didn't do too much damage anyways. For Nokhud Offensive, yeah, like I was talking about earlier, the Desecrated Ohuna, which are the birds that fly over the third boss area, now cast new Rotting Winds. And so before, it was like a really bad graphic frontal. And if you remember, the dungeon was poorly telegraphed. But now it's a kickable cast, but if the cast goes off, then you immediately wipe. And that's terrible. Also, the Desecrating Roar is now uninterruptible and summons 5 dogs and was previously 3. These mobs gave count at various points. I don't think they give count anymore. I think that's been changed. For Ruby Life Pools, the Flame Channeler's kick lockouts now 15 seconds was previously 12. Don't really change anything. And then, yeah, for Uldaman, obviously the dwarves, like we were talking about earlier, have been a little bit changed. Last thing before talking about all the dungeon mechanics and the changes and everything you need to see, there are 2 Weakauras that you probably want. First and foremost, the Season 4 Dragonflight Dungeon Weakaura pack maintained by Terathal. This is the one that I generally recommend. I think that Terathal does a really good job of going through and highlighting the most important abilities for you. Obviously, having big wigs and little wigs does work with this. It works in tandem with this, and so those are some of the things that you definitely need. I think that the Season 4 Dungeon pack that's by Terathal is pretty good. The other Weakaura is the Spell CD on Nameplates Weakaura that is maintained by Mirez. This add-on is OP. Not very balanced at all for Mythic Plus. It allows you to have a lot more information as to what the mobs are about to do to you. And so I think if you care about taking Mythic Plus seriously, this is also another add-on that you should be looking to grab. And so with those things in mind, and all the documented and undocumented changes that we've seen, let's kind of talk about what are the most important things that you need to know about each and every single dungeon. Okay, first and foremost, let's talk about Algethar Academy. I would say Algethar Academy is probably the most similar dungeon in Season 1. I would say it's going to be a bit easier due to Vengeance Demon Hunter being meta. Talking about the hard parts of the dungeon, first pull can be a bit precarious at times. There can be invisible swirlies as well if you have people, double jumping or jump like using disengage and stuff like that, hovering around. There can be invisible swirlies, which I've seen tanks get hit by and unfortunately die. In general, I would say try to avoid standing behind your tank while he's gathering the first pull. That'll be pretty big. First boss, it's on a strict cadence where you need to be making sure that you use a large defensive every minute for the burst forth cast. Try to kill the tree off as fast as possible. Those are the big things. For the mini boss, after the first boss, you want to be pre-moving it. That's a pretty big deal. So by pre-moving, I mean like you need to be like canceling your cast the moment that the graphic shows up beneath your feet. Otherwise, you're going to be dying. You can be pre-moving it whenever he starts casting it, though. On top of that, for Croth, there is a way to not get the Sonic Screech debuff. If you are pre-LOS whenever he's going to be casting a Sonic Screech cast, then you actually don't get the circle on you, and that's how you can tell that it worked properly. And so, that'll be able to extend your phase if you really want a pretty long time, like your phase 1, before any of the ground effects start. It could also help you, line up your 2 minutes for the first burn, stuff like that. A little bit easier if you do it like that. For some of the trash bombs, that's after Croth. The Scepter, again, now no longer kickable, but you're going to need to be able to stop that. Battle Axe, actually stopping the bleed on your tank is a pretty big deal. If you do have a bleed removal, such as an Evoker in your group, removing the bleed on the tank is a pretty big deal there. On top of that, there are a couple of other mobs, Mana Fiends in the books. If you're playing with Vengeance Demon Hunter, this is pretty trivial. VDH makes this area just an absolute joke. If you're playing with other tanks, you're going to need to make sure that somebody is like pretty heavily assigned to kicking the books. But then on top of that, you're going to need to be throwing a lot of AoE CC effects at the Mana Fiends and the book mobs. I think that it's really hard for you to like overuse CC in this area. And if you're playing with a non-Vengeance Demon Hunter, I just recommend like pulling a little bit smaller than you would do otherwise. The third boss doesn't do too much. You need to make sure that you watch out for overlaps of the mana bombs with the AoE cast that the boss does. There's not like a ton going on with that. As for the last trash area, you can actually mind control a restorer, and that's actually like a huge deal if you really think about it. It gives you a 50% haste gain. I think it's on like a 15-second cooldown. You do have to micro the restorer around a little bit, and it can be a bit of a hassle for like the final boss. They also changed how the last boss works a little bit, where there are 2 starting circles that are pulsing orbs out of the room, and then they kind of changed how the random stacking of like the damage gain / puddle drop mechanic works. So it should be a little bit easier, just all things considered. I generally like pulling the boss pretty far forward on pull and getting him as far away as possible from those circles that are in the middle of the room, because otherwise you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Jumping into Azure Vault, pulling the first area it's going to be something that you're going to be watching a lot of groups on stream do, where they do just a massive pull in the first area. A lot of that's going to be enabled by Vengeance Demon Hunter. Now, VDH is just so sick at stopping the lashers and stopping those rock dudes. It's possible to do, especially with Bloodlust and like a strong AoE composition, right? If you have a Destro Warlock, if you have a Shadow Priest, if you have like Destro Warlock, Shadow Priest +1, you're probably going to be able to do that pull relatively easy, even without a Vengeance Demon Hunter. But it's something that in Pugs I would be really, really careful for, because the Lasher's Mystic Vapors cast, if it goes off, you can die. I would say that if you're looking for a candidate for healer pulls for high-end groups, that is I think that there's a decent chance that that entire first area is played without a healer once you see groups actually starting to get pretty coordinated, because you don't take damage unless a Mystic Vapors cast goes off, which if a Mystic Vapors cast goes off, your healer's not healing it anyway. It's like it's one of those things that it's either kind of kick or die or stop or die, more or less. For first boss, you really need to make sure that your tank is clearing the trees, and then you I would recommend using the ping system to make sure that you're utilizing the circles to get the trees cleared up. If you have any trees left up, you're likely going to die almost like 100 to 0. It's really, really hard to live. As you get to higher keys, you need to really make sure that you're rotating defensives well or rotating externals well on people. I believe the cadence for that is like 55 seconds or something like that. So it's hard to use 1 minute every single time, but it's possible to use them, 1, 2, and then you have to skip 3 and then use it 4, 5 or something like that because it's on like 55-second cadence. Next up, there's a jump skip that you can do, jumping down to Azure Blades area. A lot of groups do that because a lot of the trash that's in the second area before the second boss is not super desirable, while the second area is kind of required, and then you get a lot of trash at the beginning in high-end groups. If you don't want to do that, you can obviously pull the ring trash, and it's not like the end of the world, but there is a jump skip that you can do after you do like 1 trash ring pull, and then you jump down to Azure Blade, and it's pretty easy. You can also go get like some of the parasol toys from Shadowlands, and that will allow pretty much everybody without a slow fall to also be able to jump down. But if you have a slow fall in your group, obviously it makes it trivial. As for the Frog Gauntlet and the Breakers have changed a little bit. Now their Shoulder Slam knockback has been removed, but it will actually increase physical damage and increases physical damage taken by 10%, and it casts less frequently. Still pretty dangerous mobs, all things considered. So watch out for those, but I think the Breakers should be a lot less toxic, especially with like the knockbacks. You're going to infrequently get knocked back by the frogs. Tailash, I would say that it's mostly the same. Movement's going to be really important here. Making sure that you drop the puddles in a good spot's important. You don't have to pre-move the circles like you used to back in Season 1. They removed that pretty late in the Season 1. So those are pretty chill. But movement's still important there. For Umbral Skull, which is the final boss, the Hardened Crystal, like I talked about earlier, changed. Where now, whenever the Hardened Crystal comes out, the Crystallize shield pulses AoE, and you can see on screen here, it is doing just a ton of damage to us. But the upside is that there's not really other damage going on the fight, so there's nothing really else to press defensives on. Now, this means that you actually want more people like hitting the Crystallized or the Hardened Crystal as it comes out and kind of cleaving the other smallies, as opposed to what you would do before, where you're like your tank, your healer, and like one DPS would be hitting the hardened, and everybody else is kind of AoEing down the rest. Now it's like you want to be prioing down the hardened until the shield is off, and then you cleave down the rest. And it's not too bad if you have like a pretty good comp. It should, and if you have people who are coordinated and doing the right things, it shouldn't be too bad. But now the healer's going to contribute a lot less damage to the shards because of it. RLP, about the exact same as it was back in Season 1. You want to invis the beginning to skip the Primal Juggernaut. For Tectonic Slam from like the Earthshaper mobs, you really want to make sure that you're either stopping it with like a disrupt effect, or you can stun it, but you can't stun it if the mob is shielded, so you can like purge it and you can stop it that way. But making sure that you stop Tectonic Slam is like a pretty big deal. Utilizing CCs and AoE kicks and making sure that you're kicking the Chill Weavers and stuff like that. That's all like pretty important in the first pull. The first area is not too bad. I would say that you need to watch out for tank damage just in general, especially the first boss, Meladrusa. She just does the most damage to your tank ever, and so you really need to be cautious about that. The intermission phases are very dangerous as well, so making sure that you burn through the intermissions as fast as possible and you kick the boss as fast as possible, that's a pretty big deal. Upstairs area, Destroyer Circles will actually do friendly fire damage, and I would say that these are heavy emphasis for your group because they actually do a considerable amount of damage to the mobs. They also interrupt the casters, including the Flame Dance and including the Cinder Bolts. So for the dance has to get stopped before the 4-second cast finishes. Otherwise, it does like a massive AoE. But also the dance just does a lot of tank damage. So the earlier you interrupt it with a stop, the better it is. For the Cinder Bolts, you're going to need to kick these. These are going to be like likely candidates to 100 to 0, your healer and your DPS. So making sure that you get a lot of kicks on these Cinder Bolts is a pretty big deal. For the two mini bosses, Thunderhead and Flame Goulet, there's ways to skip them both. For Thunderhead, it's kind of making sure if you start and you go towards the Flame Gullet side first, there's a way. The easy way to skip Thunderhead is just basically whenever he's like flying around, you actually just kind of like run straight through where he would previously be. I think that skipping Thunderhead is going to be the most likely candidate for what we see this season, because Flame Gullet, the dispel mechanic is really, really tough. You might have access to more Warlocks and Mass Dispels this season, so maybe it will end up being a little bit easier. But in general, I would say that the Thunderhead mob is the more likely candidate to get skipped. Where Flame Gullet, it's a bit more of a HPS check, and more or less like a check on do you have offensive CDs available. For Flame Gullet, you can actually easily skip around it if you just like run around the tree to the left of where Flame Gullet is. He also will fly around, and you can skip it that way too if they're in the air, so it's not a huge deal. For second boss, I would say the movement's the most important part, and the movement's actually easily done. It comes in like it's a very specific cadence where the boss will summon an ad. Okay, let's start from... So first off, the boss will cast a boulder. Bait the boulder well. Then the boss will summon an ad. You want to... It's basically a 3 interrupt rotation where you fast kick 1 and 2, and then you use the longest lockout duration. So Mage counter spell is probably the best one, but Rogue Kick is also very good here, and Warlock, Spell Lock are the 3 best kicks for the 3rd interrupt. And they want to interrupt that as long as possible, because then that will lock the ad out for an extended period of time. Then once the ad dies, it will put a large flame patch on the ground, and you want to bait the ad well. The ad baits onto ranged players only, including ranged healers. So you really want to bait the ad well and against previous fire. But at the first one, you're just going to kind of bait it wherever. And then you're going to move the boss to a little bit past the edge of the fire. You're going to bait the boulder after the first ad dies. You're going to bait the boulder back towards the previous fire. And then your ranged group is going to be clumped up against like the previous fire. And then they're going to summon another ad. And that's how it should look in theory. Is it always going to look like that? No. But that's the hardest part of the boss. And in general, you're just going to need to be making sure that you're doing a lot of damage to the ad. And then once the ad dies, then you kind of focus your fire on the boss. For the last area, it's basically some high channelers and Ravati. High channelers, they need to be interrupted. Watch out, press defensives whenever the flame or whenever the thundering storm is going off. That's a pretty big deal. For the Firecast that we talked about earlier, just make sure you lock it out. Whenever you kick the flame channeler, the mob actually puts a purgeable debuff on itself, but that purgeable debuff is actually making the mob take damage after you kick the flame channeler. Do not purge that. So leave that on the mob. That's a huge deal. For Ravati, you need to make sure that you're purging the Thundercloud's shields. So if you have a Belf purge, if you have a priest in your group, if you even have Demon Hunter purge or Warlock purge, you want to make sure that you're purging the Thunderclouds every single time if you can, because then that will reduce the amount of shielding that you actually have to eat through on Ravati, and that will actually speed up the boss or the mini boss a lot. For last boss, pushing the boss at the correct time is probably the most important thing. So you want to make sure that you're balancing damage on Urquhart, and I'm going to call it Fireack. That's not the name of it, but you want to make sure that you're balancing damage on Urquhart and Fireack. The boss pushes the moment that either one hits 50%. So the ideal push timing is whenever Fireack lands on the ground, starts doing her breath, you push both Urquhart and Fireack to 50%, and the fire breath doesn't stop, and then there's animation. So you're able to actually push the boss probably down to 40 to 35% there. You actually pop your Bloodlust at that 50% mark. That's because the dots that come out and the combination of the dots and the AoE shout at the same time can kill people. I would say that make sure that before every single one of the flame spit debuffs that will go onto players, you probably want to pre-press a defensive, because you're very, very scared here. And that's doubly true if the AoE shout is going on at the same time, because that also does a little bit of damage and it can kill you immediately. Try to drop the flame spit towards the edge. That's a pretty big tip as well. Nokhud Offensive. Nuclear difficulty dungeon. Oh my god, this dungeon is so hard. This dungeon is super hard if you're not in a coordinated group. I would say this is probably the hardest pug dungeon of the season. First area, War Spear Bleeds. Nuclear. You can CC them mid-cast. You can CC them with Ursul's Vortex. You can stun them mid-air. You can actually just port or leap away from them as well to dodge their bleeds. You can bop their bleeds. You can cauterize their bleeds. You can also hop on top of a pole like you see on screen right here. We use Warlock Gate. You can rescue up there. The downside is that you can't drop your Infernal if you're pole dancing, but it is what it is. The War Spear Bleeds, probably the hardest part of the entire first area. Longbow Shoots. I don't know what they've done to these mobs, but they are nuclear now. So that first pull that you saw a lot of people do where they would combine the first 2 packs together, not sure if that's going to be a thing anymore. Those longbow shoots are nuclear. Ahuna fixates. So basically there's a Beastmaster cast and it will cast Hunt Prey on somebody. You can stop the Beastmaster cast, that way the Ahuna won't fixate. That's ideal, I think. But yeah. For the other mob, there's a Lance Master. I believe it's on a 20-second interrupt. So I think that Mage with Short Kick, Augavoker, and Melee DPS can all kick Lance Masters. Make sure that you kick the AoE Shout. It's like a 6-second cast. Get somebody to kick it. Those are kind of all the mobs that are in the first area that we need to be watching out for. For the first boss, you want to kill as few adds as possible, ideally. The harpoons will do damage to the boss. So basically, what we do in season 1, I haven't practiced this dungeon like super extensively on the PTR. Obviously, I did it a little bit, but like what we do in season 1 is we would kill the first 2 adds, and then we would like cage 1, root 1, and then like I don't even know, cage 1, root 1, fear 1, or something like that, right? And leave those CC'd permanently, and then like we would be using the harpoons to like shoot the boss over and over again. And so we would get through like 6 or 7 rounds, because how the deactivation on the thing works is whenever the mob like contacts it, will actually start deactivating it. But that doesn't matter if the mobs are CC'd, but also if you actually CC them or slow them down for long enough, you can actually shoot the harpoon. And so then we would like, for the second round through, after the first round was CC'd, we would just like, use strong slows or Ursul's Vortex or like DK grip or something like that to grip those mobs away from the harpoon. That way we could just insta click and then it would deactivate it. So you really want to optimize like not killing as many adds as possible. Obviously, you're gonna have to kill a few, but the fewer you kill, the faster that boss is going to be, right? It's going to be able to turn that boss from a 3.5 minute boss to a 2.5 minute boss if you instead of having to focus a lot of your damage on the adds, instead you're able to focus into the boss. Second area, kicks are nuclear in the second area. Oh my god, this is so hard. Kicks on the named mob versus the storm speakers. Basically, the named mobs need 2 melee plus like a Curse of Tongues or a Trophic Poison to be able to get it down to 2 melee. Alternatively, you can just use 3 kicks. I think that 3 kicks is pretty fine on those mobs. For the Storm Speakers, these mobs also need 3 kicks, but they can be CC'd. So the best bet is to put like your Vengeance Demon Hunter +1 on the Storm Speaker, and then put your other 3 interrupts on the named Stormcaller mobs. That's in general going to be your best play. If you have a Prot Paladin, they can basically just solo the Stormcaller as well. That's like a pretty big deal if you're playing with the Prot Pally. Going in with a plan for who's kicking what is like the best idea. If you don't have a healer with an interrupt, we're really gonna be hurting here. We need to make sure that we're using a lot of CC on the Storm Speakers, not the Stormcaller. Stormcaller's name mob, but you're gonna need to make sure you're using a lot of CC on the Storm Speaker and then throwing interrupts in the Stormcaller. Thunder Beast, 3 kicks are required. I think you can actually get it down to 2 kicks if you have like Curse of Tongues and a 12. +1 kick or something, +1 melee kick or something like that. But like in general, it's gonna be 3 kicks required for pretty much every group. For the Storm Shield mobs that are patrolling around, purge those mobs. If the shield goes off, you're gonna be wiping. But on top of that, the mobs just like take a lot of health, right? It's a lot of it just makes that pack live for an infinitely long period of time. There's also some patrolling, I don't even know what the squalls maybe or what the mobs are, patrolling mobs with like a shield on them. And if you're playing with a mage, the mage can actually spell steal off this shield on the boss and have like a 10 million health shield, and it will actually stop the electrical storm from doing any damage to them. That's a big tip for the second boss if you're playing with a mage. Beyond that, for the second boss, the biggest thing that you need to watch out for is extending buffs. They did make this a little bit easier in season 1. They made the buff duration last a little bit longer, but the key tip is try to get to 10 stacks as fast as possible, and then beyond that, you just kind of try to extend it like the end of your buff duration, right? Or before you're getting blown up or whatever. And this will allow everybody, including the healers and the tanks, to be able to extend 10 stack buffs permanently. If somebody accidentally drops their buff for whatever reason, you should try to let them like catch back up rather quickly, because this boss is tuned heavily around having 10 stacks of the buff permanently. The electrical storm happens every 45 or 50 seconds, I believe. It might even actually be a minute. I'm pretty sure it's a minute now. I'm really thinking about it a little bit more. So you're able to use 1 minute CDs for defensives on that. For third area, the Ahuna that I talked about that fly around or kick or die. Beyond that, it's about the same as it was in the past. It's not like too bad. There's There's some volleys that need kicking. There's a decent amount of interrupts that you're going to need to have happen. But tank damage is pretty high in this area. So those are probably the biggest things. But the Ohuna are definitely kick or die, to the point where I'm not even sure if you want to pull those mobs. Those mobs kind of suck. Third boss, the AoE Gale Shear cast is now on 57-second cycle. It's a very hard hit. I remember rogues in Season 1 were getting just farmed by the boss. You need to cycle defensive super well to be able to make sure that that boss is not dangerous. On top of that as well, the boss does a shoot mechanic, which Clothies, including primarily Shadow Priest, I think, is incredibly scared of. Balakar Khan, you're actually able to skip the mini bosses. How you do this is you tag them with an ability, you pull the mini bosses. While you've done this, your tank will pull the boss, and then you meld the mini bosses off. Mini bosses weren't necessarily seen as efficient count. I don't expect this to be something that people regularly do in pugs, although it's not very hard to deal with. For Balakar Khan, meld is incredibly good on Balakar Khan because you're able to actually meld the spear cast that's on you, and it doesn't recast. And so that actually saves your group a lot of damage. It saves you the required ability to press defensive. I believe that there's a way to bait the spear. So I believe the spear goes on one of the nearest 2 people that haven't been picked. So yeah, you can actually bait the spear on specific people. And so you're going to need to actually make sure that you're using like large defensives for the spear. And then on top of that as well, in phase 2, whenever the electrical storm phase is happening, on the circle drops, that hits harder than the first phase. And so you're going to need to make sure that you're also maybe popping defensive for that as well, because otherwise you're going to be potentially dying. Halls of Infusion. I'd say first area a bit easier. Containment apparatus damage is down a bit. 1 melee kick on the containment apparatus. I would use CCs on the demo shout. Watch out, don't get bled by those mobs that do the demo shout. This first area was historically the hardest part. There's also an engineering orb as well, which will allow you to get like a cheat death effect. Lasts for like 30 minutes. So that's pretty good. I would make sure to grab that. It's from engineering. It's like on the left side at the very first area. On top of that, first boss, Mass Dispel's been nerfed pretty significantly, meaning that the Dispel mechanic for the first boss is going to be a little bit harder, particularly in Phase 2. So in Phase 1, you don't necessarily have to use Mass Dispel. You need to make sure that on sets that you don't have Mass Dispel on you, you're going to need to be popping a defensive if you do also have that dot on you. But the puddles are small enough to where it's not going to be like that dangerous. In Phase 2, without MD on every other set, you can actually be running into a lot of problems. If you don't have MD for a set, they need the person that has the debuff on them for the first boss, Watcher Iridius, needs to make sure they pop a massive defensive, because then they're also going to be running through the nasty lightning zone. So it's going to be a pretty big deal. Next up, Gulping Goliath. I would say that Gulping Goliath is just kind of like a movement check, not overly challenging, making sure that you just bait spawns in a good spot, making sure that you let the boss eat your tank, making sure that you kite the frogs that are fixated into the group, use any AoE slow on those froglets if possible. That'll be sick. There's also now a checkpoint after Gulping Goliath. Awesome, thank God. It's definitely something that was super needed. Moving forward, the dragons, they put like an AoE frost debuff on you. The first one should probably be dispelled by a priest if you have a priest. If you have a mass dispel, that's awesome. Alternatively, you're going to have to just pop like a large defensive. You can use it with snare you can also remove it with snare removal effects, such as, fade, snare removal, shape shifting, freedom. So that can also get the dot off of you, just being a rogue naturally. That kind of stuff. So that cast is actually pretty scary, and the dot was pretty scary in the past. I think it got nerfed a little bit during Season 2, though. So hopefully it's a little bit better. For the third boss, making sure that you just don't bait the tornado towards the pillar. Let your healer heal you. Stack up for the efflorescence. Stack up for the Mistweaver Monk healing. Those are probably the biggest things. For the Bridge Gauntlet, Bridge Gauntlet's pretty hard. You can actually LOS. If you use a large model, such as any large character model as well, you can actually shoot mobs over the middle pillars and over the side pillars. And so that'll actually allow you a lot of leeway and a lot less movement if you're playing a caster. So use like the Ganon Braid or something like that. Gammon Braid, I think, is probably an easy way to doing that. But I would also recommend maybe LOSing the dragons that are on the bridge. So whenever I was talking about mass dispelling them after Gulping Goliath, I think that LOSing them on the bridge is actually pivotal. On top of that, there's the mini boss at the end starts one-shotting you eventually at like super high keys. You're gonna need to be popping defensives or making sure that you always have something available for yourself at like high level keys. I don't necessarily want to talk about like CD rotation cycling because that's something that's like really, really advanced. If you have like super in-depth questions about how to cycle your CDs for your specific group, I can definitely talk about it. But in general, you're probably just going to want to be like standing off to the side. There's also like lips of the edge that you can actually stand on as well. And so like if you stand on the lip, you actually can't get clipped by this running water that's coming down the sides, and that'll also allow you to move a little bit less. But those are probably the big things. The last boss, it changed a little bit. It's I would say a lot easier now that the intermission only happens one time, and now moves it from like a 6-minute fight to like a 3:30 fight, so a lot more in line with other fights. Neltharus, we talked about the chain changes earlier. Don't necessarily need to cover those again. I would recommend going Magma Tusk, then into Chargath, and then to Forge Master. Still doing a large first pull, but now it's probably the mobs that you're clicking are going to be a little bit less deadly. The hunters are a lot scarier now that they're not going to get blown up by the chains. The hunters are the mobs that like leap on you and put a bleed. Those mobs are BS, frankly. But I would do a pretty large first pull with your Bloodlust, and then go to Magma Tusk. Magma Tusk without Lust is still pretty tough. Probably the hardest boss. Forge Master is really hard. Probably the hardest boss in here still, though. But Magma Tusk is more about coordinated movement. But you want to use your first, set of offensive cooldowns in your Bloodlust on the trash, and then you take your second set of offensive CDs basically into Magma Tusk. And so that's kind of how we're trying to path this out. For Magma Tusk, it's like, I would say a triangle or a square strat both work pretty well, where you're dashing the boss pretty far away, but making sure that you're staying grouped up for your healer to be able to heal you. A lot of healers really want you to kind of not only be within their range, but also kind of be like stacked up with one another. Stacking up on the boss, if you don't necessarily know what you're doing, is probably optimal. You can just be in there with melee as well. Doesn't really matter too much. You're going to lose a couple of casts if you're a caster that you don't really want to, but it's better to get receive healing. And then so like you dash the boss pretty far, and if you draw like a square around the room, he spawns in the top left hand corner, and then you dash him towards like the exit, and then you dash him towards the back wall, and you dash him back across towards the left wall. That's probably the optimal movement and the easiest movement for most groups. And doing it like that allows your fire to despawn. Should make for a pretty easy fight. There's a lot of damage on this fight. Pop defensive whenever you have the debuff on you. Any passive healing that works on yourself, it's huge. For Chargath, I would say instant pop a chain, and then probably the melee DPS. If you have a melee in your group, one of the melee DPS want to insta pop their chain on the boss, just to make sure that you're getting the dot rolling. You don't want to do one debuff and then like 2 debuffs. You want it to be 1-1-1. So you insta pop one, and then you slow pop the other 2 of them. And then once the boss gets stunned, he takes a bonus damage, and so it's not like a huge deal. They did make the boss a bit easier. If you die, you can actually get battle res now, which is good. Let's talk Forge Master next. Forge Master, really, really hard fight. You want to make sure that you're popping defenses whenever he's doing his anvil hits. That part is really dangerous. On top of that, after his anvil hits, he'll like throw his hammer at you and put a dot on you. The person who is targeted with his hammer, if they meld, he will cancel the cast and will not recast. Meld is OP on this fight. It is broken. So having a bunch of shadow melds in this group, or mage with invis, honestly, Night Elf mage, probably also not too bad. Very good on this fight. For Warlord Saga, we talked about it a bit earlier. Should be easier without a decurse. You still want a decurse, but it's not like the end of the world. You want to make sure that at least... Okay, so ideally 4 people have a thing, but 3 people using an ability normally breaks the shield. 4 is 100% safe. So making sure that you pick up the abilities off the ground and utilizing them on the boss, and talking about who's going to use what is going to be the most consistent for speedy delivery and speedy kill on this fight. Up next, Uldaman. I hate this dungeon. I think this dungeon sucks. Bosses in this dungeon are nuclear difficulty, and they all got harder somehow. I don't even know how this happened. The Berserker mobs, which are the big... I don't even know what they are. Troll bonk dudes. Berserkers. I don't even know what they are. They actually put an enrage buff that will make the mobs take more damage. They cast it at 50% HP. I've seen people take the Berserkers into the Lost Vikings. I've seen people take Berserkers into Bromac right as the 50% thing is happening. But the enrage buff does make the mobs take more damage. It will also make them beat the tank pretty hard. So watch out. But they also take more damage, so, we're fighting fire with fire here. We gotta go fast. For Lost Vikings, the Lost Vikings now, whenever they're on their boat, they do an ungodly amount of AoE damage. Where previously they wouldn't do any AoE damage because this was a buff that was scaling with M0 difficulty. And so it didn't matter. And now instead, it does full damage. And on top of that, Eric will cast a shield and a shoot at players, and particularly Clothies are very, very scared of the shield cast. It does scale with armor. There's a physical damage hit, so armor is pretty good versus it. If you're playing a Balustrade, for example, you use Bear Form and you're never taking damage, you're never dying versus that. But for any Clothy, like Shadow Priest or whatever, they're going to need to make sure they press Dispersion to make sure they're not dying. Same with Disc or whatever. They need to make sure they're popping something big. DP. Something like that. For Bromac, focusing on the totems, probably the biggest part. Having a balance of AoE damage and totem killing is going to be important, but making sure that the totems die is a pretty huge deal. You can also stand on the tents to make sure you don't get leapt on. That's, again, important for Clothies because the leaps from the mobs are very dangerous. Now, the downside is that then the mobs will leap on melee DPS, potentially melee healers. If everybody's able to get up on the tent, though, it only will leap on the tank. So that's actually pretty good. It'll also keep all the mob stacked. So, I don't know. It could be good. So I just wanted to throw that out there. For Talandris, stunning Talandris can be good, but only whenever it's casting the Inexonerable cast. Okay, beyond that, you kind of want your tank to be stunning it. And so, but whenever the Inexonerable cast is going off, the boss can actually get restunned before the cast ends, and then it will recast it. And so, but then that will add a stack to it. And so this boss kind of ramps up over time as it phases, and then the bleeds start hitting harder, and the earth-shaking roar cast that it does, the stomp, I don't know what it's called, the stomp, just call it stomp, also will start doing more damage as he gets more stacks, up to, I want to say it's up to 5 cycles. Having a bleed removal from an evoker is awesome in this place. And God forbid if you have 2 evokers, if you're playing Aug plus Prez or whatever, you're big chilling on bleed removal. Having any dwarves also sick for this key. That boss is so hard though. Having Bloodlust for this boss, you should get to this boss about the 11-minute mark. So you should have Bloodlust in most situations, but having Bloodlust for that boss makes it much, 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 much easier. I don't think it's doable without Lust kind of thing. Emberon, not too bad. Making sure that you have Dispels and Mass Dispel make that fight a much easier situation. Obviously, this is, I think, Mass Dispel's best key. After Emberon, the only thing to watch out for the golems, they do an Earthquake cast. You want to be LOSing that. The end of the dungeon, you actually want to do a skip. You can do skips with either Mind Soothe, you can Invisibility Potion, you can just natty run around. There's a lot of ways that you can actually skip the end, but I would recommend skipping a lot of the trash at the end. Those mobs are not very fast. I think they're incredibly slow mobs, just in general, to be playing. So skipping the end is pretty good. Deos, I would say that getting the debuff off of you, especially before the Wing Buffet cast happens, is probably the most important part. Having defensives for the Wing Buffet just allow your healer a lot more leeway. But if you have any snare removal, like we kind of talked about earlier, you're able to get the debuffs off of you. It's also a magic dispel effect, so you can actually use Imp, you can use Mass Dispel, you could again, snare removal effects such as shapeshifting or freedom or whatever also remove it. So that's a pretty big deal for Deus. Last dungeon, Brackenhide Hollow. Fate and Mind Soothe and Priest in general are OP in the first area because it actually allows you to, pull a lot less trash, pull a lot less undesirable trash, get the cages open a little bit easier. So having a Priest in this key is 2 thumbs up. There are specific cages that you want to open. It's pretty standard in the high end what cages are going to be opening. And so it's going to be front left, front right, and then it's I would say close to the boss on the back right. I'm just gonna show them on screen right now and marked on like an MDT as to which ones that typically people open, just so you guys can see. For first boss, you need to make sure that you're actually killing the totem whenever it spawns. If you have a dispel in your group, again, this is another reason that priest is like really good. So like Shadow Priest is actually able to dispel the tank whenever the healer is getting totemed. This mechanic is super troll, by the way. This allows, you know, the fight to go a lot easier if you just have a bonus dispel on, you know, either an imp dispel or a mass dispel. On top of this melding, you can actually meld off the... I don't even know what the name of the mechanic is. Whenever the boss leaves behind you, I don't know, call it Vendetta. Whenever he Vendettas you, you can actually meld that off. And that's a pretty big deal. On top of that, there's a Grievous style mechanic on this boss. Whenever he bleeds you, you have to be healed over 90%. You can utilize things such as, you know, DP, you can health stone, you can health potion, you can press renewal, renewing blaze before it happens to be able to get yourself topped up. And those are all pretty optimal there. Second area, not too bad. Treemouth, making sure that you rotate people inside of his AoE and making sure that your rotate AoE stops on the slimes are probably the only important things. You can also have your mage jump in, he can block the cast, you can Warnstone out, you can bubble out, you can AMS his consume. And so you actually want to rotate the eat targets, but if you have any of those effects, it will let you, you know, skip a shield first off, so the boss isn't going to get shielded, which is, you know, you're going to make the fight a little bit faster. But it's also just a bit of an easier fight if you're able to do that. But you need to rotate eat targets. Sync Breath, I would skip, similar to what we did in Season 1, where you can Mind Soothe by him and run. You can, you know, jump the gap with on a mount as well. Warnstone, Wild Judge Cross, that kind of thing. Fade by. For second boss, you need for third boss, sorry, Gut Shot. You need to bait traps and the fixates really well. I think this is the boss that's the easiest to mess up, especially it's like a pretty big noob trap. The hyenas also act like classic mobs whenever they're trapped, and so basically what you want to do is you actually want to like build a trap line like around the edge, and then you want your DPS and the boss to be playing towards like the edge, and like have the only line that the hyenas can actually attack you from involve running through a trap. And then you kind of the hyenas will like die off to the trap damage eventually, so you don't want to do like a ton of damage to them. I mean, you want to do some, but you don't want to be like hard AoEing them or anything like that. Rod Hexer's Withering Contagion cast, like I talked about a bit earlier, at the top of this, has been changed. It does a ton of damage. You need to make sure that you open the alchemy file cauldron thing immediately. And the moment that you see that Withering Contagion cast get put on, you just immediately file. There's no playing around with it anymore. That it needs to be pressed almost immediately. You're going to be taking just a gorillion damage if you don't. And then the hardest part of the dungeon, Decatriarch's Totems. You can desync it to where you only get one totem per phase with the hyenas, but like there's no way that I'm going to be talking about that in just like a normal video. How I would recommend having like a Baloralos, a Grief Torch, or a Beacon on all of your DPS, on most of your DPS, on all of your DPS, plus your tank and your healer. You could even put it on after the second boss if you'd like, because you're going to be spawning a checkpoint. And then whenever that checkpoint is spawned, you're going to be able to like zone out, port out, and then port back in with that trinket on if you don't want to play it for the entire key. But killing the totems is going to be the biggest deal. Decatriarch will die periodically, just like over time, but making sure that you have large damage, such as, you know, an SKB proc. If we have a Void Torrent, we want to make sure we're dropping our Shadow Crash on every single one. We want to make sure that we're like full Astral Power. We want to make sure that we're actually a Fury Warrior or something like that, right? The melee DPS comps have a lot easier time, I would say, killing the totems, which means that they have an easier time in this dungeon just as a whole. But yeah, making sure that you have enough damage for the totems, that's a pretty big deal. And that's it. That's all that we need to know about this season's dungeons. Again, come check me out on Twitch. If you like the content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Actually means a lot. It's helping me grow. And I'm going to be doing more and more of this content as we get closer towards War Within. So if you like the style of content, I'm going to be probably releasing daily videos after the War Within launches as well, kind of talking about, you know, focusing on Mythic Plus and improving and stuff like that. Beyond that, that's going to be it for me today. I hope to see you guys in the next video. Hope to see you guys on my Twitch, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.